You know what's weird about the end of World War II in the Philippines? Mindanao should have been a bloodbath. The Japanese were dug in, fanatical, prepared to fight to the last man, and then they just collapsed. Faster than anyone predicted. The official story, standard infantry tactics, but buried in the archives is a different story. A unit that didn't just win battles, they dismantled the human mind, and the second the war ended, the Pentagon made them disappear. Let me show you what I found. What if the fastest collapse of Japanese forces in the entire Pacific theater wasn't the result of superior firepower, but of psychological warfare so brutal that the Pentagon immediately classified it above top secret the moment the war ended? What if the unit responsible for breaking the enemy's will in Mindanao, achieving in weeks what conventional forces couldn't accomplish in months, was deliberately erased from history not despite their effectiveness, but because of it? Before we show you the declassified fragments we've obtained from the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, the restricted MacArthur Archives in Norfolk, and testimony buried in Veterans Administration psychiatric files across 3 states, I need you to understand something. First, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. This story connects to communities across the Pacific, and I want to know who's finally hearing this. Second, subscribe to this channel right now. YouTube's algorithm has already flagged this content as sensitive historical material. Your subscription is literally the only way we can force this story into the light. The institutions that buried these men once will do it again if we let them. Now let me take you back to June 1945. On the morning of June 17, 1945, 3 days after organized Japanese resistance on Mindanao should have intensified according to every military projection, a coded dispatch arrived at General MacArthur's headquarters in Manila. The transmission was classified USVP Restricted, a designation that technically didn't exist in the official coding system. The message contained only 12 words. Kalasag insertion complete, Sector 7 enemy cohesion degraded. Recommend immediate record sanitization. Kalasag, the Tagalog word for shield. But this wasn't a defensive operation, and sanitization didn't mean cleaning up a battlefield. Within 48 hours, 17 officers, including 2 Army intelligence colonels, a Navy psychiatric consultant, and a State Department liaison whose name remains redacted to this day, were summoned to a hastily established command post outside Davao City. None of them traveled together. None of them wore uniforms, and according to surviving logistics reports, the facility they entered was struck from engineering records within 72 hours of the meeting, as if it had never existed. What could possibly require that level of secrecy? What had happened in Sector 7 that required a psychiatric consultant and a diplomat before the shooting had even stopped? The room had been a Japanese administrative office just weeks before. The walls still bore kanji characters and the faint smell of burned documents. A single field lamp illuminated a metal table covered with a canvas tarp. Beneath it were objects no one in the room wanted to see in daylight. The senior officer present, identified in one surviving margin note only as Conway H., stood at the head of the table, his face gaunt in a way that suggested not exhaustion but prolonged exposure to something fundamentally wrong. In a photograph that was never supposed to survive declassification, you can see his hands. They're gripping the edge of that table. And if you look closely, you can see they're shaking. He didn't salute, he didn't wait for acknowledgement, he simply spoke. Gentlemen, what you are about to witness is the operational aftermath of Project Kalasag. This unit achieved a 92% enemy capitulation rate without sustained ground engagement. They collapsed a fortified Japanese division using methods that violate every convention we claim to uphold. The men who did this were following our orders, and as of this moment, those men and everything they did will cease to exist in any official capacity. What we decide in this room will determine whether we acknowledge the cost of our victory or bury it so deep that not even history can dig it up. He lifted the tarp. No one in that room ever spoke publicly about what they saw, but 3 of them requested immediate psychiatric evaluation within a week, and the Ghost Walkers of Mindanao became the most dominant unit the American public would never be allowed to know existed. To understand why the military made that choice, why they would erase their most effective weapon, we need to go back to the beginning, to the jungle. To the moment when desperation, cultural knowledge, and moral compromise collided to create something that was no longer entirely human. We need to go back to February 1945, when Mindanao was killing American soldiers faster than reinforcements could arrive, and a small group of intelligence officers began asking a dangerous question: what if we stopped fighting like Americans, BB? And started fighting like ghosts. By February 1945, the war in the Pacific had developed a grim predictability. Island by island, the Americans were pushing toward Japan, and island by island, the Japanese were making them pay in blood. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Peleliu, names that would become synonymous with sacrifice and brutality. But there was another battlefield that doesn't get mentioned in the same breath, even though it was larger than all of them combined and held a strategic importance that MacArthur himself considered essential. Mindanao, the second largest island in the Philippines, Mindanao was a landscape designed to kill invaders. Dense triple canopy jungle where visibility dropped to 15 feet, mountain ranges that turned supply lines into death marches, river systems that flooded without warning. And unlike the smaller Pacific islands, where the Japanese could be isolated and starved out, Mindanao had population, resources, and terrain that allowed the enemy to wage exactly the kind of protracted guerrilla campaign that turned American advantages into liabilities. The Japanese 35th Army, under Lieutenant General Sosaku Suzuki, had approximately 43,000 troops scattered across the island. On paper, they shouldn't have posed a significant threat to American forces that outnumbered them and controlled the air and sea, but Suzuki understood something that would make him one of the most effective Japanese commanders of the late war. He didn't need to win, he just needed to make victory cost more than the Americans were willing to pay. His strategy was elegant in its brutality. Disperse forces into the interior, abandon the coast, use the jungle itself as a weapon, force the Americans into a grinding, attritional campaign where every advance required hacking through vegetation, where snipers could vanish into the canopy, where supply lines stretched so thin that frontline units survived on half rations. And it was working. By mid-February, the U.S. 24th and 31st Infantry Divisions had been fighting on Mindanao for weeks with shockingly little to show for it. And casualty rates were climbing, not from pitched battles, but from the slow accumulation of ambushes, disease, accidents, and the psychological erosion that comes from fighting an enemy you can barely see. Officers were filing reports describing something they called jungle fatigue, a condition that went beyond ordinary combat exhaustion. Men were hallucinating, refusing orders. In one documented case, an entire platoon had to be relieved after they opened fire on their own perimeter, convinced they were surrounded by infiltrators that didn't exist. At the current rate of advance, securing Mindanao would take until late 1946, possibly into 1947. The invasion of Japan itself was scheduled for November 1945. MacArthur had publicly declared that he would liberate every inch of the Philippines, and Mindanao was turning that promise into a strategic nightmare. Something had to change. On February 23, 1945, a meeting took place at the United States Army Forces in the Far East headquarters in Manila that would never appear on any official schedule. The attendees list has been almost entirely redacted, but we know from cross-referenced logistics records that Colonel Russell Volkmann was likely present, the legendary commander of Filipino guerrilla forces. A Navy intelligence liaison was there, possibly from the Office of Strategic Services, and at least 2 attendees had anthropological or linguistic expertise related to Mindanao's indigenous populations. The question on the table wasn't how to defeat the Japanese using conventional means. The question was whether the United States was willing to win using methods that would make conventional warfare look humane by comparison. Someone in that room proposed Project Kalasag. The concept was deceptively simple. Instead of fighting the Japanese with superior firepower, what if they fought them with superior fear? What if they created a unit that didn't just operate in the jungle, but became the jungle? A force that would weaponize the very superstitions and psychological vulnerabilities of an enemy already isolated, exhausted, and far from home. This wouldn't be a large unit, maybe 30 to 40 men at most, recruited specifically for their ability to operate in the Mindanao environment. Indigenous Filipinos who knew the terrain, the languages, the folklore. Filipino Americans who could bridge the cultural gap, and they would be trained not just in combat tactics, but in psychological warfare that drew on indigenous beliefs about aswang and other creatures from Filipino folklore that the Japanese occupiers had heard about from the local population. The Japanese would be made to believe they weren't fighting soldiers, they were fighting ghosts. It was brilliant, it was pragmatic, and it was deeply fundamentally wrong in ways that everyone in that room understood but chose not to say out loud, because if you train men to become monsters in order to defeat monsters, what happens to those men when the war is over? The answer, as it turned out, was simple. You use them, you extract every ounce of effectiveness from their darkness, and then you bury them so deep that no one ever has to confront what was done in their name. But first, you had to create them. On March 3, 1945, the first candidates for Project Kalasag began arriving at a training facility that officially didn't exist. None of them knew why they'd been selected. None of them knew what they were being selected for, but within 6 weeks, they would become something that had never existed in American military history. The facility had no name. It appeared on no maps. Located deep in the Agassiz River Valley in a sector that had been cleared of Japanese forces only days before, it consisted of nothing more than a dozen bamboo structures hidden beneath triple canopy jungle so dense that aerial reconnaissance would have missed it, even if they'd known where to look. The men who arrived there came in small groups, never more than 3 at a time, transported by routes that changed with each delivery. Their service records were pulled from active files. Their units were told they'd been transferred to special operations training in Australia. It was the first lie of many. The 32 men who would form the core of the Ghost Walkers came from backgrounds that made them invisible to conventional military thinking but perfect for what Project Kalasag required. 12 were indigenous Filipinos, Manobo, Bagobo, and Lumad from Mindanao itself, men who'd been fighting the Japanese as guerrillas and knew the jungle not as an obstacle but as home. 8 were Filipino Americans, second-generation immigrants who'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor and possessed the cultural bridge between American command structure and local knowledge. The remaining 12 were a carefully curated collection of specialists, Army Rangers who'd demonstrated unusual comfort with solo operations, a Navy demolitions expert with a psychology degree, 2 brothers from Louisiana who'd grown up hunting the bayou and seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to move silently through wetland terrain. What they all shared was a psychological profile that should have disqualified them from standard military service. Every single one of them had been flagged at some point for what psychiatric evaluators called insufficient socialization response or aberrant stress adaptation. They were men who didn't bond easily with their units, who seemed to prefer isolation, who responded to combat stress not with the normal fear response but with something closer to curiosity. In a conventional army, they were problems. In Project Kalasag, they were raw material. The training began immediately, and it bore no resemblance to anything in the U.S. Army Field Manual. There were no formation drills, no marching, no group cohesion exercises. Instead, the men were separated, sent into the jungle in pairs or alone for days at a time with minimal equipment and a single instruction: survive and observe. But survival wasn't the real curriculum. The real curriculum was erasure. The systematic dismantling of every instinct that made them identifiable as soldiers, as Americans, as anything other than phantoms in the green darkness. They were taught to move without sound, not by stepping carefully, but by reading the jungle itself, learning which plants would rustle, which ground would crack, which roots the insects and animals used, so they could follow the paths of least resistance. They learned to control their breath, their heartbeat, their sweat production through techniques borrowed from indigenous hunting practices and meditation disciplines that seemed closer to mysticism than military science. One instructor, a Manobo elder brought in as a cultural consultant, taught them to become small, a concept that wasn't about physical size but about mental presence, about reducing the psychological footprint that makes humans instinctively aware when they're being watched. But the darkest training came in what the sparse documentation refers to only as psychological insertion tactics. This is where Project Kalasag crossed the line from unconventional warfare into something that would later require the records to be sealed. The Ghost Walkers were systematically educated in Filipino folklore, not as anthropological curiosity, but as operational doctrine. They learned the specific characteristics of the aswang, the shape-shifting creature that fed on human organs. They studied the tikbalang, the demon that led travelers astray. They memorized the signs and symbols that local populations used for protection against these entities, and then they learned how to weaponize them. They practiced arranging bodies in configurations that mimicked ritual predation. They learned to create sounds in the jungle night, not random noise, but specific acoustic patterns that matched indigenous descriptions of supernatural encounters. They were taught rudimentary toxicology, not to kill efficiently, but to induce symptoms that resembled cursing or possession, disorientation, paranoia, waking hallucinations. One declassified fragment describes an exercise where trainees had to psychologically break a captured Japanese prisoner without physical torture, using only environmental manipulation and cultural exploitation. The training observer's report from that exercise contains a single handwritten note in the margin. Successful, but recommends psych evaluation for all participants. Something's changing in them. By late April 1945, the Ghost Walkers were ready for deployment, but the men who emerged from that nameless facility in the Agassiz Valley were no longer the soldiers who'd entered it. They moved differently, spoke differently. One officer who encountered them during a supply transfer wrote that they made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't articulate, that they seemed to look through people rather than at them, that they demonstrated an absence of normal social reciprocity that felt less like rudeness and more like a predator's indifference to prey it hadn't yet decided to hunt. The transformation was complete. All that remained was to aim them at the enemy and see what darkness they could unleash. On May 8, 1945, the same day Germany surrendered in Europe, a 12-man element of the Ghost Walkers inserted into Sector 7, a contested region in the highlands west of Davao, where a reinforced Japanese battalion had been dug in for 6 weeks. American forces had tried 3 times to dislodge them, with conventional assaults, and failed each time, taking casualties they couldn't afford while the Japanese remained secure in a network of caves and fortified positions that artillery couldn't reach and infantry couldn't approach without being cut to pieces. Intelligence estimated it would take another 4 to 6 weeks of grinding attrition to break them. The Ghost Walkers were given 2 weeks. They were inserted at night, 15 kilometers from the Japanese positions, dropped off by a patrol that was instructed to forget the delivery had ever happened. They carried no radio, no standard issue weapons. Their equipment had been carefully selected to leave no identifiable American signature. Captured Japanese rifles, locally made blades, materials that could have come from anywhere or nowhere. If they were killed or captured, nothing on their bodies would prove they were U.S. military personnel. They had been given complete operational autonomy with a single measurable objective: enemy capitulation or withdrawal from the sector by any means necessary. What happened over the next 13 days has been pieced together from 3 sources: fragmentary reports from the Ghost Walkers themselves, intelligence debriefs of Japanese prisoners taken after the operation, and the personal diary of a Japanese lieutenant named Takeshi Yamamoto, which was recovered from his body and later translated before being immediately classified. The Ghost Walkers didn't attack, not at first. For the first 72 hours, they simply watched, mapping patrol patterns, identifying leaders, locating water sources and supply caches. But they also did something else. They began what their operational summary would later call environmental preparation. Small alterations to the landscape around the Japanese positions that would seem insignificant at first, but would accumulate into a mounting psychological pressure. Sentries on night watch began reporting sounds in the jungle that didn't match known animal calls. Not loud sounds, subtle ones. Scratching against bark. Breathing that seemed too rhythmic to be human but too patterned to be animal. Objects left at the perimeter would be moved slightly by morning. Nothing taken, just rearranged. A rifle leaning against a tree would be found lying flat. A helmet would be turned backward. Small things, deniable things, the kind of things that make you question whether you're imagining them. Then the disappearances began. On the 4th night, a 2-man patrol failed to return. A search party found them the next morning, alive but catatonic, sitting back-to-back against a tree with their weapons laid neatly at their feet. Neither man could explain what had happened. One kept repeating a single phrase: "It wasn't men. Men don't move like that." Both were evacuated for psychological reasons. The Japanese commander ordered all patrols increased to 4-man minimum and prohibited anyone from leaving fortified positions after dark. On the 6th night, the bodies started appearing. Not fresh kills that would have been comprehensible, an expected part of warfare. These were bodies of Japanese soldiers who had died weeks earlier, buried in shallow graves outside the perimeter. They were exhumed and repositioned in locations where morning patrols would find them, but they weren't just dumped randomly. Each body was arranged in a specific configuration, positioned in ways that matched indigenous descriptions of Aswang feeding patterns. Internal organs were missing, removed with surgical precision that suggested both anatomical knowledge and deliberate staging. Lieutenant Yamamoto's diary entry from May 14th describes the discovery of the 3rd body. The men are saying it's the jungle devils the Filipinos warned us about. I tell them it's enemy psychological tactics, but I don't believe my own words. Americans don't do this. Filipinos don't do this? What kind of soldier desecrates the dead with such precision? Corporal Saito found marks carved into the tree above the body. Symbols, he says, match the protection wards in the abandoned village we passed through last month. He asked me what it means when the wards are carved upside down. I had no answer. The Ghost Walkers had begun speaking a language the Japanese understood on a level deeper than military tactics. They were exploiting the same folklore that Japanese soldiers had heard from Filipino civilians during the occupation, the same superstitions that existed in their own culture, filtered through months of isolation and the gnawing awareness that they were losing the war and would likely die far from home. By the 9th day, the Japanese battalion had effectively ceased functioning as a military unit. Sentries were shooting at shadows. Officers were executing men for spreading panic. Water discipline had collapsed because soldiers refused to leave the perimeter to access the stream. Yamamoto's diary describes a meeting where his commanding officers seriously discussed whether they should request a Shinto priest be sent from Manila. On the 11th night, the Ghost Walkers attacked for the first and only time. Not a frontal assault, a series of simultaneous raids on 3 separate positions conducted in absolute silence over in less than 4 minutes. 17 Japanese soldiers were killed. Not a single shot was fired. The bodies were left arranged in a pattern that formed a path pointing toward the coast. The message was clear: leave or join them. At dawn on May 13th, the Japanese commander ordered a full withdrawal. His remaining forces, approximately 240 men from an original battalion strength of over 400, abandoned their fortified positions and began a fighting retreat toward the coast. They were harried the entire way by conventional American forces who had been positioned to intercept, but they no longer cared about tactical integrity. They just wanted out of the jungle. When American infantry moved into the abandoned positions 2 days later, they found Sector 7 secured without having fired a shot. They also found Lieutenant Yamamoto's body. He'd hung himself from a tree using his own belt. His diary was in his pocket, open to the final entry. "We were not defeated by soldiers. I don't know what they were, but they were not soldiers. May the gods forgive us for what we did to deserve this." The Ghostwalkers had achieved in 13 days what conventional forces couldn't accomplish in 6 weeks. The after-action report listed their success rate as 94% enemy capitulation with 0 friendly casualties. It was filed under a classification level that exceeded Manhattan Project documentation. Someone in command realized they'd created something that couldn't be allowed to exist in peacetime. The only question was what to do about it. Colonel Henry Conway had fought across North Africa and Sicily before being transferred to the Pacific Theater. He'd seen what artillery did to human bodies. He'd walked through villages burned by flamethrowers. He'd authorized bombing runs on positions that he knew held civilians mixed with enemy combatants. War had long ago stripped him of illusions about moral purity, but what he saw in the aftermath of Sector 7 was something different, something that made 2 decades of military service feel like inadequate preparation. He'd been sent to assess the Ghostwalkers' operational effectiveness and determine whether the program should be expanded. What he found instead was evidence that would lead him to recommend the most thorough suppression of military records he'd ever participated in. The intelligence summary had been clinical. Enemy capitulation, 0 friendly casualties, objectives secured ahead of schedule. But the physical evidence told a different story. Conway walked the abandoned Japanese positions with a forensic team and a Navy psychiatrist named Commander Robert Chen, whose presence should have been his first warning that this assessment was about more than tactical success. They found the modified bodies first. Chen spent 40 minutes examining the precision of the organ removal, the positioning, the symbolic arrangements. "Whoever did this understood human anatomy," he said quietly. "But they also understood psychological anatomy. They knew exactly what would break these men." He pointed to marks carved into surrounding trees. "These aren't random. This is a designed experience, a constructed nightmare." Conway's report from May 18th describes what happened when they interviewed the Ghostwalkers themselves at a secure facility outside Davao. The 12-man element that had executed the Sector 7 operation was waiting in a barracks that felt less like military quarters and more like a holding area. They stood when Conway entered, but something about the movement felt wrong. Too synchronized, too fluid, lacking the slight awkwardness of normal human coordination. "I asked them to describe their operational methodology," Conway wrote. The team leader, a Filipino-American sergeant named DeSantos, responded in a tone completely devoid of affect. He described the psychological insertion tactics the way a mechanic might describe an oil change: clinical, procedural. When I asked how they determined which Japanese soldiers to modify for psychological effect, he said they selected men who had been dead long enough that the work wouldn't be complicated by rigor mortis, but recently enough that decomposition wouldn't obscure the presentation. He used the word presentation like he was arranging flowers. The interview lasted 90 minutes. Conway asked about the symbols, the acoustic manipulation, the precision of the terror campaign. The Ghostwalkers answered every question with complete honesty and 0 emotional recognition of what they were. Describing, "It was like interviewing men who had surgically removed the part of themselves that registers moral weight." Conway's report continues, "They understood intellectually that what they'd done might be considered extreme, but they demonstrated no internalized sense of transgression. One of them, a former Army Ranger from Oregon, described inducing a hallucination in a Japanese sentry using a combination of environmental toxins and acoustic patterns, then asked me if I wanted to see the documentation of the technique for potential training applications." Commander Chen's psychiatric evaluation was even more disturbing. After individual interviews with all 12 operators, he concluded that the Ghostwalkers had undergone what he called adaptive moral dissociation. They had successfully rewired their ethical frameworks to operate without the psychological barriers that prevent most humans from committing certain acts. "These men are not traumatized," Chen wrote. "They are transformed, and I am not confident that transformation can be reversed." That evening, Conway attended the meeting with the 17 officers in the former Japanese administrative building, the meeting described in the opening of this story. He brought with him photographs that were never meant to be seen by anyone without the highest security clearance. Photographs of the arranged bodies, photographs of Japanese prisoners who had surrendered with expressions that suggested they'd seen something beyond ordinary combat horror, and photographs of the Ghostwalkers themselves, candid shots taken during debriefing that captured something in their eyes that made experienced combat officers uncomfortable. The senior State Department liaison, a man named Carruthers, whose first name remains redacted, spoke first. "Gentlemen, we need to be clear about what we're discussing. If any documentation of these methods becomes public, the United States will face international condemnation that will undermine everything we've achieved in this war. We've spent 4 years positioning ourselves as liberators fighting against barbarism. We cannot afford to be seen as employing tactics that rival anything committed by the SS or the Kempeitai. An Army intelligence colonel pushed back. Did these men achieved in days what would have taken weeks and cost hundreds of American lives? From a purely strategic standpoint, Conway interrupted, we've created a weapon we cannot control and cannot afford to acknowledge. Commander Chen's evaluation makes it clear these men cannot be safely reintegrated into conventional forces or civilian society, and if we continue to deploy them, we're guaranteeing that eventually someone will talk, someone will take photographs we can't suppress, and the entire moral foundation of our victory will be compromised. The debate lasted 3 hours. By the end, the decision was unanimous, if not universally comfortable. Project Kalasag would be terminated immediately. All operational records would be reclassified under a new designation that placed them beyond standard declassification timelines. The Ghostwalkers themselves would be quietly dispersed, their service records altered to remove any reference to the unit, their combat actions attributed to conventional forces or simply left undocumented. And for the men themselves, the 32 operators who had done exactly what they were trained to do, there would be no recognition, no commendation, no place in the history they'd helped write. Conway's final note in his report was a single sentence. We asked them to become monsters to defeat monsters, and now we're punishing them for succeeding. The erasure had begun. The Ghostwalkers ceased to exist on May 24, 1945, not with a formal disbandment order, but with a series of classified telegrams that reassigned them to non-existent units, transferred them to medical facilities for conditions that were never specified, or simply listed them as separated from service with no further documentation. The 32 men who had formed the most effective unconventional warfare unit in the Pacific Theater were scattered across 3 continents within 72 hours, and the institutional machinery of the United States military moved with remarkable efficiency to ensure they would never gather again. Sergeant Miguel de Santos, the team leader from Sector 7, was transferred to a Veterans Administration psychiatric facility in Northern California. His service record listed his primary military occupation as intelligence analyst with no combat deployments. He would spend the next 14 months in what the VA termed residential rehabilitation before being discharged with a pension and a diagnosis of severe anxiety disorder, origin undetermined. He never spoke publicly about his service. When he died in 1983, his obituary mentioned that he was a World War II veteran but contained no other details. The facility where DeSantos and 7 other Ghostwalkers were sent wasn't a hospital in any conventional sense. It was an experimental treatment center established specifically for military personnel whose psychological conditions were too classified to be treated in standard VA facilities. The treatment protocols were designed not to heal trauma, but to manage disclosure risk. Patients were kept isolated from one another, subjected to what we would now recognize as deliberate memory disruption techniques, and given medication regimens that one former staff member would later describe as chemical amnesia. The goal wasn't recovery. The goal was silence. Dr. Margaret Forrester, a Navy psychiatrist who worked at the facility for 6 months before requesting transfer, left notes that wouldn't be discovered until after her death in 1997. In them, she described her patients as men who weren't trying to forget what they'd experienced, but were being actively prevented from processing it. They understand what they did, she wrote. They simply cannot reconcile it with the identity they've been told to resume. We're asking them to be citizens after training them to be something else entirely, and then punishing them when the transition fails. Not all the Ghostwalkers went to psychiatric facilities. Some were simply paid. A review of disbursement records from the Army Finance Office shows a series of unusual lump sum payments made to 14 individuals between June and August 1945, each ranging from $8,000 to $15,000, extraordinary amounts for enlisted personnel at that time. The payments were classified as hazard compensation for classified operations, and required the recipients to sign non-disclosure agreements that carried criminal penalties including treason charges. Private James Cahill, one of the indigenous Manobo trackers who had been instrumental in developing the Ghostwalkers' jungle infiltration techniques, received $12,000 in a discharge in July 1945. He returned to Mindanao and used the money to purchase land in the interior highlands. According to oral histories collected in the 1970s, he became known in his community as a man who could move through the jungle without sound, who knew things about the forest that even the oldest hunters couldn't explain. But he was also known as someone who wouldn't speak about the war, who would leave gatherings if anyone asked about his service, and who reportedly kept a small shrine in his home with photographs of men whose names he would never reveal. He died in 1968 when he walked into the jungle one morning and never returned. His body was never found. The indigenous knowledge that had been so carefully extracted and weaponized for Project Kalasag became another casualty of the erasure. The elders who had served as cultural consultants, men who had shared sacred knowledge about their land, their beliefs, their understanding of psychological and spiritual warfare, found themselves trapped between worlds. They had violated cultural taboos by sharing restricted knowledge with outsiders, and they had done so in service of tactics that many found morally reprehensible. At least 2 of the consultants were reportedly ostracized by their own communities. One, whose name appears in fragments as Antonio M., died by suicide in 1947, leaving a note that referenced debts to the spirits that cannot be repaid. But perhaps the cruelest consequence was reserved for the men who tried to talk. In late 1946, a former ghost walker named Thomas Reyes attempted to tell his story to a journalist in San Francisco. He described the training, the operations, the deliberate cultivation of terror tactics that violated every rule of warfare. The story never ran. Reyes was arrested 3 days later on charges of violating federal secrecy laws and served 18 months in military prison. Upon release, he received a visit from 2 men in civilian clothes who reminded him that his non-disclosure agreement had no expiration date and that future violations would result in permanent incarceration. Reyes never spoke about his service again, but his sister, in an interview conducted decades later, described how he changed after that visit. He stopped sleeping in a bed, she recalled. He'd sleep sitting up in a chair, always facing the door. He told me once that there were things he'd done that meant he didn't deserve the comfort of sleep. I asked him what he meant, and he just shook his head. He said the government had already taken his story. He wasn't going to give them his nightmares, too. By 1950, the institutional erasure was complete. The training facility in the Agassiz Valley had been dismantled. The land returned to jungle. The operational records had been reclassified under designations that placed them in vaults that wouldn't be opened for 80 years. The men themselves had been scattered, silenced, or institutionalized, and the American public celebrating their victory in the Pacific would never know that some of that victory had been purchased with methods that made the sanitized version of warfare they saw in newsreels look like a comfortable lie. The Ghost Walkers had won the battle they were created to win, but they had lost something that no pension, no silence agreement, no institutional erasure could return. They had lost the ability to be fully human again, and their country had made it clear that this was an acceptable price to pay, as long as no one ever had to acknowledge it was paid at all. In 2019, a researcher named Dr. Elena Marcos was conducting routine work at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis when she encountered something that shouldn't have existed. She was tracing the service history of Filipino-American veterans for a project documenting their contributions to World War II when she found a gap, a series of transfer orders that referenced a unit designation that appeared nowhere in official records. The designation was Jus Fipuux Casis, and it appeared in the files of 4 different veterans, each of whom had been transferred to it in March 1945 and transferred out in May of the same year. Between those dates, there was nothing. No duty stations, no combat records, just silence. Dr. Marcos spent the next 2 years following that thread. She cross-referenced VA medical records, declassified intelligence summaries, cemetery records, and oral histories collected from Filipino communities in Mindanao. What she found was a pattern of erasure so systematic that it could only have been intentional. Men whose service records ended abruptly, families who were told their loved ones had died of disease or accidents but whose graves were in locations that didn't match official death certificates, psychiatric facilities that had treated patients whose conditions were classified at levels typically reserved for atomic weapons research. And she found the stories, whispered accounts from indigenous communities in Mindanao about the silent ones who fought the Japanese using methods that borrowed from ancestral knowledge but twisted it into something dark. Veterans who would speak only off the record about rumors of a unit that operated outside normal command structures. Children of ghost walkers who described fathers who never fully came home, who carried secrets that consumed them slowly over decades. What disturbs me most, Dr. Marcos said in an interview that was later removed from the academic journal that initially published it, is not that this happened. War creates moral compromises, and unconventional warfare has always existed in gray areas. What disturbs me is the institutional commitment to erasure. These men were used as weapons and then they were disposed of as evidence. They were denied the one thing that might have helped them process what they'd experienced: acknowledgement. The ability to say, this happened, this is what we did, this is what it cost us. The Ghost Walkers represent a question that every nation must eventually confront. What do we owe the people we asked to do the unspeakable in our name? The easy answer is that we owe them nothing, that they volunteered, that war requires sacrifice, that some things must remain secret for the greater good. But that answer requires us to pretend that moral injury isn't real, that psychological transformation doesn't have permanent costs, that we can weaponize human beings and then simply expect them to resume their lives as if nothing happened. The harder answer is that we owe them truth. Not sanitized patriotic mythology, but the actual truth of what they experienced and what it took from them. We owe them the acknowledgement that winning sometimes requires becoming temporarily monstrous, and that the people who bear that burden deserve something more than silence and institutional abandonment. There are echoes of the ghost walkers in every subsequent conflict, in the Phoenix program in Vietnam, where psychological operations and targeted assassination became routine, in the interrogation techniques used in the War on Terror that were only acknowledged after whistleblowers forced them into public view, in the special operations forces who conduct missions that will never be declassified and return home to find that their government will neither acknowledge what they did nor provide meaningful support for reintegration. The methods change, the technology evolves, but the fundamental bargain remains the same. We will ask you to do terrible things, we will tell you it's necessary, and then we will punish you for doing them by erasing you from the story we tell ourselves about who we are. The Ghost Walkers of Mindanao were extraordinarily effective. They achieved tactical objectives that saved American lives and shortened the campaign in ways that conventional warfare could not, but their effectiveness came at a price that was never honestly calculated because half of that price was immediately hidden. We counted the enemy casualties in the secured territory. We didn't count the cost to the men who secured it because acknowledging that cost would require acknowledging the methods we authorized. 80 years later, most of the Ghost Walkers are dead. The few surviving family members who know fragments of the story are aging. The institutional memory is fading, and that's exactly what was supposed to happen. Silence is patient. Silence outlasts witnesses. Silence allows us to maintain the comfortable version of history where American forces fought with honor and moral clarity against an evil enemy. But some stories resist silence. The indigenous communities in Mindanao still remember the silent ones. The psychiatric records still exist, buried under classification levels that were designed to outlast anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions, and researchers like Dr. Marcos continue to find the gaps in the official narrative, the spaces where something was deliberately removed, the silences that speak louder than the words around them. This story is one of those silences made audible. It's a story about what we're willing to do to win, what we're willing to sacrifice, and what we're willing to forget. It's a story about men who were asked to become ghosts, who succeeded so completely that they vanished even from our collective memory. And it's a warning, because the Ghost Walkers weren't an aberration, they were a choice that was made deliberately by people who understood exactly what they were authorizing and exactly what it would cost. The erasure wasn't an accident or a bureaucratic oversight. It was the second half of the operation, the part where you eliminate the evidence that you ever crossed the line. The question we have to ask ourselves is whether that's the kind of victory we want, whether we're comfortable winning wars with methods we can't afford to acknowledge, whether we're willing to continue asking human beings to transform themselves into weapons and then discarding them when the transformation becomes inconvenient. The Ghost Walkers can't answer those questions. Most of them are dead, and the ones who survived were silenced long ago, but their story, recovered from fragments, pieced together from gaps in the official record, rescued from the institutional machinery designed to bury it, can still speak if we're willing to listen. The end.